Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Time is Relative, a conversation with Einstein author and illustrator Torben Kuhlmann and Professor Marianne Martens. My name is Ricky Stock. I am the Managing Director of North-South Books, and it's my great honor to introduce our speakers. Marianne Martens holds a PhD in Library and Information Science and is Associate Professor at Kent State University, where she teaches courses on youth services librarianship. And she has worked previously as a children's librarian in New Jersey, was a former vice president at our very own North-South Books, and has extensive experience as a translator, including translating children's books from German to English. And now it's with great pleasure that I present to you my fellow German native, author and illustrator Torben Kuhlmann. Torben is going to take us behind the scenes of his new book, Einstein, The Fantastic Journey of a Mouse Through Space and Time, which is going to be on sale on September 7, and which already has its very own website, themouseadventures.com. Torben is the creator of 3 other mouse adventures: Lindbergh, The Tale of a Flying Mouse; Armstrong, The Adventurous Journey of a Mouse to the Moon; and Edison, The Mystery of the Missing Mouse Treasure, which received the Bachelor Honor Award in 2019. Marianne, thank you for leading us through this event. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the lovely introductions. So first of all, I'm a super fan of Torben Kuhlmann's work, so this is really a pleasure to be able to have this conversation. And I know, Ricky, you asked me to summarize the book briefly, and so I just wanted to take you through my first impressions here. So we have this very smart mouse, and finally the day of the great cheese fair has arrived. He can't wait to go and have some samples. But when he arrives, he finds out sadly that he got the date wrong, and he just can't understand how this happened because he'd been counting the days, tearing off pages on his calendar. But the quest for the cheese leads him to some very interesting thoughts about how he might be able to turn back time and get to the cheese fair on time. So first he starts turning back the hands on all the clocks he can find, and he even makes it to the great clock in the center of town and jams the hands on that clock. But aside from creating a little bit of chaos, nothing else happens. At the clockmaker's shop, he meets a mouse who happens to be a very talented watchmaker, and the mice engage in some interesting conversations about what exactly is time. Because he happens to be in Bern, Switzerland, and if you know anything about Albert Einstein, he actually worked at the patent office in Bern from an early part of the 19th century. And our mouse goes to visit the patent office where Einstein worked. There he finds some seminal works to study, including Einstein's theory of relativity. And armed with new knowledge about theoretical physics, as mice generally are, he manages to build a time machine and travel back in time. First to meet Einstein in 1905, indirectly, he solicits his help with riddles left on the desk each night. And through these riddles, he's able to repair his time machine and travel forward and make it to the cheese fair. In the book, Torben Kuhlmann mixes historical fiction with a healthy dose of magical realism. And as a huge fan of his art, this book does not disappoint. His watercolor work demonstrates that not only is time relative, but when you think of what our little mouse friend accomplishes, size is also relative. And from a librarian perspective, the endnotes are amazing. First of all, there's a bio of Albert Einstein with a nod to the influence of his first wife, Mileva, and lots about his theoretical work, all explained at a simplified level. I don't want to say child-friendly level, because I think that if I say that, the idea of who this book is for is another good question. And I think it's simplified. So, an older child could get a lot out of it as well. And so there's just tons of everything that connects with what we call STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math in this book. And I really think it has such wide appeal. So thank you so much, Torben, for creating this amazing work.
Thank you.
And I think our next thing is to look into Torben's studio.
Right next to me is my little drawing corner. I think you can't see it pretty good, but here there's the place where I spend most of my time. And as you can see, most of the time there's a wonderful scenery outside of the window, but I have to block the window because there's sunlight almost the whole day, and you need very dry daylight to draw, to do your watercolors. So I have to block out the sun most of the time.
So do you only work with watercolor? Do you use computers at all? I know so many artists are scanning their work in and then modifying it digitally. Do you do that at all?
I try to not be forced to do that with a computer. I try to be as precise as possible while working with watercolors and pencil. And sometimes I use some kind of Photoshop retouch later, but most of the time I try to be as authentic on the drawing paper as possible. So, but I, of course, I use a computer for scanning my artwork, for doing the book layouts, for almost everything else.
Well, I love that because first of all, there's an archive of your process for something for people to study in the future, which is really tricky with digital files, because often with digital files, it's like, here you go, here's a flash drive and here's this perfect book. And you don't see, and you know, it's interesting you say that you try to be very precise and yet you're using watercolor, which everyone knows is a really tricky medium and very imprecise, often difficult to work with. So that's especially amazing that you're doing it by hand.
Sometimes it's a real struggle with the watercolors, because you have a precise idea and a drawing already on the paper, and now you start with your watercolors, and sometimes it just doesn't work the way it should. For example, there's always my biggest problem is that the colors, when they dry, they change their appearance. Sometimes when the color is still wet, it's a bright red, and then when it's dried, it's just a muddy brown. So that's my my biggest struggle. But I have a little trick developed over the years, because as you can see, this is my watercolor case, and I was always worried how the color will look on paper, and so I created this little preview of each color in this box, so that I can see ahead of time what the dried version of the color will look like.
That's great. That's a really good trick, because yeah, watercolor is super imprecise. And I know you and Ricky have a video about your process as well. And it's so interesting to see. I know you start with pencil and then go to ink and then go to watercolor. And meanwhile, you're working on this paper that you've stretched out almost like a canvas. And it's just fascinating to see. And the time that goes into it is something I think people don't really think about. And you said that for one spread, you can spend days on one spread or one page even.
Thank you so much. Now we would like to show you Torben's Making of Einstein video. And after that, we will continue our conversation.
Hi everyone. Today we are going to take a look behind the scenes. I'm going to show you how my illustrations are created. In the beginning, I use a sketchbook. This is where I create a rough first draft. Next, I'm prepping the watercolor paper. It gets soaked in water and then placed on a board. First, the now wet paper gets pulled tight. That way, it won't become wavy even when it's getting soaking wet again. I fasten it to the board with special wet tape. Once that's dry, the work can begin. First, I roughly apply the lines of the sketch to create a general composition. The illustration now becomes more and more detailed, first with pencil, but once that's pretty much accomplished, I use the fine liner pen, which of course I won't be able to erase. Once the drawing is done, it's time for the watercolor paint. Now I'm starting to color in the drawing I just created, applying different colors directly while mixing others. I often start with a background, or, like in this case, the sky. And this is how, layer by layer and on top of a drawing, the watercolor painting is created. Several hours or even days later, the artwork is finally complete.
Would you talk a little bit about, besides, the color that you've just talked about? We know you're using watercolor on paper. We know that you have your tricks with the paint. But one of the things that I think you're such a true master of is perspective. And, the lines in your art and the way, an image like this one here, where, we have this incredible perspective. We see this throughout your art. That's just one example. But what inspires you with that?
Well, I think that is just my natural way of thinking about storytelling. I always have an idea of some kind of scene that would happen, and I almost imagine me as some kind of cameraman or cinematographer. I try to find the best way to, on a visual level, tell a story. That's always some kind of topic in my books, to find the best solution how to tell something without words. So you can use perspective, atmosphere, light, scenery, to compose an illustration, a scene that can tell you almost anything, so that you don't need much words in addition. And that's the reason why I'm so happy when working on a new project, because I can just explore several ideas. It's almost like someone drawing a storyboard for a motion picture, because I try to visualize scenes, moments, events, and then I try to find the right perspective, the right camera angle, and then I do my sketches in the sketchbook, and from there the illustrations start. But you can read my sketchbook almost like a storyboard for a movie.
You can read the book like that too, because I thought of that as I was reading the book. I think there is this cinematic quality to your work. That's so interesting that you said that. So that just confirms what I was thinking when I was looking at the images. And I think your wordless spreads are beautiful, and they absolutely carry the story. That's always something that, you think about from, if you're someone who is more of a writer, as I am, certainly not an illustrator, and you think about, carrying the story across the art, and that's something that you definitely are a master at. And so that also, you mentioned one thing, and this character of the mouse. I wanted to know why you choose mice in many of your stories.
That started with my first picture book, Lindbergh, many years ago. And it all started with a very tiny idea, my first idea for a children's story, a picture book. And it was just a play on words, 2 words in German, Maus und Fledermaus. That's mouse and bat. But you can hear there's a similarity between mouse and Fledermaus in German. So my idea was that a normal, everyday mouse is inspired by a Fledermaus, a bat, to learn to fly. And the only way to achieve that is to build some kind of contraption. And that was the basic idea. And from there, the story develops. But you can see, even at this early moment, it was clear that the main protagonist would be a mouse because of the basic idea. And from there, it's just developed. Lindbergh became a grander story about the history of flight and the first flight over the Atlantic and the inspiration of Charles Lindbergh, who later did the same, flying over the Atlantic after the mouse. The next book, Armstrong, was also just in a way a continuation of that, because after the history of flight, there came the history of space travel in human history. And I just adapted that for my mouse cosmos, where a mouse is scientifically interested in the moon and has radical new ideas of a moon circling the Earth and being just a great ball of stone, which is something no mice will like to hear, because everyone else is under the impression that the moon must be a giant cheese. So you can see the next story also is very mouse focused right from the beginning. So after that, I just stayed in this very adventurous mouse-sized universe.
Well, also the tiny mice enable you to have this, to play with perspective. I mean, certainly
Yes.
in Lindbergh, you have that huge thing, the tiny mouse with the giant ship, and then you have the flight and everything else. And in this book as well, there's so much fun you can have when you start with this teeny tiny character, and then you can play with all those things. So I can imagine that's fun.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know, you have like these very STEM anchored books, which I absolutely love, by the way. I love the fact that you have one book about, Lindbergh, and then Armstrong, and then Einstein. And, so there's these great ways to introduce kids to some of these amazing figures throughout time, or concepts, or, flight and space and the theory of relativity, through a picture book. You can have this introduction in a way with an entertaining story, with a very engaging mouse and engaging art and everything else, and then your endnotes here allow a reader to have some further exploration on their own. So I really think you could read this with a really young child. You could read it with a 5-year-old child, and they would be entertained with the mouse and everything else. But you could also read it with a middle school child who's learning about physics, or is about to start learning about physics. And I think, what a fun way. I wish I had this book, because I might have been a little more interested in physics than I ended up being. But so from that, do you have a background in science? Do you have a strong interest in this from something in your life?
Well, there's definitely a strong interest. Almost all the time since I was a kindergartner, or even before that, I was always interested in how the world works, and I was very curious to learn how things operate, how a car engine works, or something like that. And at a pretty early age, I started drawing things. For example, I wanted to understand how a combustion engine works, or a steam engine, or something like that, and to just make little observations and little drawings. And later, when I was a little bit older, I tried to build that kind of contraption in the backyard, with not that great of a success. But you can see there was always some kind of scientific mind at work, but also a very huge interest in drawing and painting and learning techniques there.
Well, it's like one of my favorite genres, this kind of exploration, and to do it through your art is a great way to do it for young readers. So with these books that you've already started, what's your next project then? Are you continuing in this vein?
Right now, I'm just looking for ideas for the next possible field. But there will be new mouse adventures on the horizon, I'm sure. And because there are so many people who can lend their name for another mouse adventure.
Oh, for sure, for sure. You have unlimited material, definitely. I wanted to ask you about the pandemic and how the pandemic has treated you. How was it? First of all, how was it to continue your work during the pandemic? Was it good for you, or was it really bad that you were on lockdown and you couldn't go out?
Well, as an illustrator and author, you are almost always in some kind of lockdown. So
Yes.
that did not affect my work very much. When the whole pandemic started, I was just crossing my fingers that we were still allowed to work somewhere else, that we are not locked in your own apartment, because I have the studio here and my equipment and my colors and the necessary light. So I was happy that I could continue work here in my studio. But later, when the German edition of Einstein was released, which was in September 2020, there was the second wave of Corona already developing, and things were shut down bit by bit. So we had a tiny window to do a very small book promotion, and that was my biggest hurdle during the pandemic, because we had so interesting events planned. My publisher in Switzerland had organized several tours through Switzerland, for example, and there was also a visit in Bern scheduled, which we had to cancel.
Yeah, that's such a difficult time, but I'm glad that it didn't affect your creative work, because I know for some people they just sort of felt very depressed about the situation and have had a hard time. But no, definitely, and also certainly a lot of my own work is like that, where I write journal articles and I sit and I need quiet, and so for that it's been okay in some cases.
I'm still happy that I can work here in my studio, but I have to say that after over a year, I would appreciate a light at the end of the tunnel soon.
Yes, definitely. And perhaps a live visit to a conference to present instead of a recorded one. Yeah.
That's also something I start to miss more and more, because I was very lucky to have the chance for many book tours and book readings with kids. And it's almost over many months without any kind of real life reading or something like that. So I hope that will be possible soon.
Yes, and to see some child feedback on Einstein as well, in particular. Well, I think our time is up, but thank you so much for this informative conversation. Always lovely to see you. And thanks so much. And Ricky, do you want to come back? Hello.
Yes, thank you so much. That was amazing, Marianne and Torben. Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. And I would like to thank all of you for watching. And now, last but not least, let's take a look at the beautiful Einstein trailer Torben created for us. Enjoy. We would like to hear from you. Please email us at info@northsouth.com or message us on social media and let us know what you think. E-galleys are available on NetGalley, Edelweiss, and by request at info@northsouth.com. We love to see your reviews, so please tag us at North South Books. Have a great ALA.